Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here with a special episode this week. We are joined by Dr. Jacqueline M. Kory-Westlund. How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. I'm super excited to have you on. So this episode, we are going to talk about something that I think a lot of listeners are interested in, and frankly, I'm interested in, but really don't know all that much about, which is robotics, and specifically human society and just humans in general's interactions with robotics. So the thing that kind of kicked things off for this episode was we did an episode on the Cats movie, that like the trailer that came out, and everyone was so freaked out about the, how human-like and weirdly when the trailer came out, people were really weirded out by the kind of how human-like those cats were, but still somewhat off. And it had us do kind of a discussion around the uncanny valley, and this idea that as mimics of humans start to get, or things that are supposed to mimic human-like features and attributions, as they get closer and closer to being able to do that, there's a portion where they become, you start to have negative feelings about them. They make you feel some like almost an ennui or something, right? Like an angst. Before then it starts to come back again, and then you feel comfortable with the human-like robot or human-like image. And so we wanted to talk about robotics and just kind of talk about how humans interact with robots and everything else. And that's really what your background is in. So why don't you give listeners a little bit of an idea of kind of where you're coming from, what your background was in terms of education and everything else, and what brought you to study this?
So my background is in a lot of different things, actually, fairly multidisciplinary. My bachelor's was in cognitive science, which I picked because I wanted to know how people work. I did not learn how people work. I learned that there's a lot of questions out there, still not quite as many answers as I was hoping for. And one of my research experiences as an undergrad was with a professor who did a lot of stuff with robots. I ended up spending a year working on human emotion. I've done a lot of different things. I ended up in grad school at the MIT Media Lab, working in a social robotics or human-robot interaction lab with Cynthia Brazel, the Personal Robots Group. And my research there focused on how young children can interact and learn from social robots, but also how they think about them. Because robots are a new technology in the kinds of technology that we interact with every day. I mean, there's some robot vacuum cleaners out there. We're starting to see a lot of voice agents and voice assistants. Like, think Alexa, Google Home. Like, these are everywhere. There's like 50 million Alexas installed in people's homes, or Amazon Echoes. But robots are still more in the realm of research, at least when it comes to robots in homes.
Sure.
That are not just for entertainment. Yes, there's a few out there now, but they're not out there at the scale of the voice agents or factory robots.
Got it. Okay. So first off, I guess, why don't you give us a little bit of an intro? I think when people hear robots, so my research was in nanotechnology. Mm-hmm. And one thing that always came up was this idea of like a nanobot. And it always, I thought, was really funny because you'd have groups. This wasn't so much, research groups in serious labs or anything else, but you had people who would hear what you did and ask like, well, how close are we to nanobots? You know what I mean? Or things like that. And it's kind of, to me, always been a bit of a misnomer, because when I think of a robot, at least, I sort of think of multiple moving parts that don't just do like one thing. Do you know what I mean? Like to me, let's say like a pulley and a winch wouldn't be a robot, right? Mm-hmm. But how do you draw that line? What would you define? How would you define a robot versus, say, just a machine?
I don't think there's a huge difference when you just use the word robot.
Okay.
I mean, in the field that I'm in, human-robot interaction, like, we qualify the word robot with other words. So, like, social robot is a common term that we use to talk about the robots that I work with.
Okay.
Or factory robot is the kind of robot that you'd find, I don't know, in a warehouse somewhere, or, like, building cars. Mm-hmm. Because a robot is a machine.
Sure, sure. I guess what I'm wondering is, so there's something though, or I don't know, for some reason in my mind at least, and maybe this is completely, maybe this is just a difference without cause or whatever. But in my mind at least, a robot suggests something like a central processing unit or something that can be altered, right? That
Okay.
it can do multiple things, or that it has
Mm-hmm.
some kind of, I don't
Okay.
know, it has some kind of brain, right? As opposed to it just being like, at least in the world of nanotech, let's say, a particle that's been coated with some kind of peptide or something, that means that it'll adhere to certain disease agents or cancer cells or whatever, right? Like that's not a robot. That's just kind of good
So I think
engineering.
you're thinking robot implies something about a central process, a central, I don't know if I'd want to call it a brain because that implies a lot about biology.
Yeah, but kind of though.
Something about
Yeah.
autonomy,
Hmm.
perhaps, or something being programmed to do certain kinds of behaviors.
Like, yeah, it doesn't. I guess what I would say is it. But again, maybe this is just a difference. Maybe this is just because of the
Different
media's.
fields, yeah.
Yeah, like maybe this is
Yeah.
just because of what I expect robots to be, right? Because what I was about to say was I would think that a robot would be able to perform its function or get or figure out how to do its function kind of regardless of the situations I placed it in. But then I think about my robot vacuum cleaner, and I remember all the times that it's gotten like stuck on carpet and been like, I cannot do anything about this. I am now dead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay, so that's kind of an interesting distinction. But so you also make though these distinctions between a social robot and maybe kind of a working robot, and I think that distinction is a little bit more clear to me at least. But in terms of social robots, um what are some of the things that are it's what are some of the goals or the applications that are hoped that they'll be able to achieve, let's say?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, also, one point on the previous, even roboticists in my field don't agree on what the word robot is. You can find us at conferences debating what's the definition of a robot.
Okay.
So it's even not clear among people who work with robots for a living.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
even they will debate like what counts as a robot. Where do you draw the line?
Sure. Sure,
Um,
sure.
so social robots. There are a lot of different places that social robots can see. Let's talk actually for a second about what a social robot actually is,
Sure.
because I think that's unclear probably for a lot of listeners because they're like, well, what makes a robot social? What does social even mean? And it's a robot that is designed and built to interact with people in ways that people find more natural and easy to deal with, like human-like ways of communication. So they use, like, say, human social cues like gaze or gesture or posture or language or speech
Hmm.
to help people understand what the robot is trying to do and help people with whatever task they're trying to accomplish with that robot. So unlike a factory robot, which is programmed to do, it's going to move this screw over there, it's going to screw that thing in, it's going to move this there. Like, there's nothing in how that factory working robot is made to make it like really understandable to a human what that robot is doing or what it's trying to do, what its goals are, what it was programmed to do. So the difference with a social robot is that the robot is designed with humans in mind, with
Mhm.
the goal of having humans around that robot interact with that robot.
Interesting. Okay.
So the application areas are, I mean, anywhere where people are, but some of the big ones are areas where in society they're kind of like large gaps to fill because of personnel challenges, because of people leaving professions like healthcare or education, mental health, aging populations. Like these are kind of some of like the big challenges that society has in general. And so bringing anything in that we can to help kind of fill the personnel gap to help people with the challenges that people have. Those are places where social robots are being researched a lot. So like education, healthcare, robots that will help. There's some like collaborative, like workplace type applications. My expertise is in education, obviously, and
Okay. Sure. So that's it's interesting from kind of, I guess, from a historical and I suppose philosophical viewpoint, right? I mean, if you
hmm,
think about what, right, I guess kind of it would appear that the central promise of robots, or what the central, um, the central promise of machines, I guess, is the ability to kind of scale work in a way that isn't possible or is not as easy and clean with a lot of humans. So I mean, if you think like Henry Ford introducing kind of a mechanized building process to his car factories, right, found a way to scale up car production with humans, and then replacing those humans with robots, right, it kind of gets rid of a job class that maybe can be done in that way, but leaves humans. But in the same way, though, that didn't kind of, I think, have the promise philosophically that we'd always hoped for, which was, or at least in my mind was always hoped for, which would be technology would take over some of these kind of more menial tasks and leave humans available to do leisure activities, I guess, or more creative activities, right? I mean, if you think about kind of the Jetsons, right, as the kind of pinnacle of robotic goals, the robots are doing all the kind of jobs that we would think, factory jobs and service jobs and everything else. And then the Jetsons appear to be living in a society of great wealth and great, just kind of great leisure and everything else. But that doesn't really seem to have been the case, right? At least in terms of the robots that have been used to take over factory jobs. It just, those people were displaced, and maybe we're still in that period of displacement. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering though, with social robots, right, the same kind of thing I think I would imagine would happen, right? Which is, let's take like nursing, for example, right? If there are nurses that can, there are some jobs that I think people would argue a robot could never take over. What do you think about arguments like that? Let's say nursing or education. Education is probably a better example because it's more your kind of background and wheelhouse. But what would you say to someone who thinks that, you could never, say, replace a teacher with a robot?
I mean, that's a good question, and we've gotten that from teachers. When we've taken robots to preschools and say, "Hey, can we run a study in your classroom?" The teacher's like, "But are you trying to build a robot that's going to take my job?" Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we say, "No, that's not what we're trying to do at all." So it's a where people have, because of the media portrayal of robots. I mean, name off the top of your head 3 movies that have robots in them. Is it going to be like Terminator?
Yeah, Star Wars? It's not good. I mean, Star Wars is probably the most positive portrayal of robots, yes. Maybe.
Yes.
But otherwise,
Big Hero 6 is another one. Big Hero 6 has a pretty good
robot. Sure, yeah. Otherwise, it's like robots taking over, right?
Yeah, everything's robots taking over. Terminator is the one that comes up the most. Uh-huh. So there's this huge media portrayal in the U.S. in particular that robots are negative. They're going to take our jobs. They're taking over, whatever. And when you talk to people who actually build robots, the goal is not to replace people. Mm-hmm. Like in education, we're not trying to build robots that are going to take teachers' jobs. Instead, we're looking at the fact that in education, say, when it comes to language and literacy, kids' reading skills are huge predictors of their academic success in schools, in formal education. Mm-hmm. But fewer than, I don't know what the stats are off the top of my head, fewer than 2/3 of American children reach proficiency at literacy proficiency, where they're so in education, kids, their reading skills are huge. Reading is one of the predictors of success in formal education, but only 1/3 of American children are reaching basic levels of literacy, and 2/3 fail to reach proficiency levels of literacy. Can measure it with deep reading comprehension processes, critical analysis, inferential reasoning, which tend to be necessary for higher paying professions. Children who fail to read adequately in first grade have a 90% probability of reading poorly in fourth grade too, and a 75% probability of reading poorly in high school. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these stats kind of show that early intervention in reading, in literacy, and language development is really critical. But when it comes to say access, only 40% of U.S. children attend a quality preschool program prior to entering kindergarten. So so people are just get more kids into preschools, spend more on teacher education, make more parent programs that help parents figure out what they're supposed to be doing with their kids. We've been putting money into that as a society, but that hasn't fixed the problem yet. And technology is one way that's scalable, often affordable and accessible as an intervention that could perhaps address part of this big problem in society.
Got it.
That's
Okay.
the kind of thing motivating like the research in my group, or the group I was in at MIT. Like, we're developing social robots that are going to help fill a gap in society that people can't fill. We're not replacing people who are there. There just aren't people there. So we're saying, okay, maybe we can use some technology to augment what people are doing, to facilitate human connections with each other, to serve as practice partners for children, like when it comes to like language and storytelling abilities and stuff, so like vocabulary. Like, the robots are not replacing the teachers. Like, actually, we've interviewed teachers as part of some of our projects, like preschool teachers, like what would you want if you had technology in your classroom? If you had a robot, what would you want it to do? And they're like, that would be awesome. We would like it to help kids learn some social skills. We'd like it to help them learn vocabulary. Maybe they could help them learn how to share. Like, they're thinking of the robot as a tool that they can use in their classrooms to help the kids learn skills that they need to learn, and give the teachers like the time and energy to like provide more individual attention to specific children. You know, they're thinking of it as one more thing that they can use, one more tool in their toolbox.
Got it. Okay. So it's not right. So like what you're saying then, it would be something like, or maybe one good example or one interesting example might be something like, you have this student population that's currently being underserved in terms of the ability, like, so for instance, during grad school, and even for the last couple of years, even I've tutored on the side, right? So I tutor as kind of a, it started off as kind of a nice way to make extra money, and then now it's sort of been a fun way to like challenge my, I don't know, it's weird. I like it. I like tutoring, right? And so, but tutoring is as a service is limited generally, unless you are willing to kind of give your time for free or do charity work or whatever. It's limited to students that, frankly, in the first place, probably didn't need the tutor anyways, because they're getting so much extra attention at home and they're in better schools and everything else, right? And so this might be a way, say, for instance, to introduce extra learning opportunities or extra training opportunities to students who are underserved now because there just aren't people willing to do the job for the prices that are needed. Right? Is that kind of a good example of something like this? Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So I wonder, so that's really interesting. I wonder how do you get over that gap though of people thinking, because I mean the thing is too, right? Even if the initial plan or the goal isn't to displace people, inevitably I think it's going to be an easy target for people to say, I've been displaced by robots, And I mean, it's kind of been the continuous thing since, one of the most common, I guess, tropes, like racist tropes or xenophobic tropes throughout history has been, right? Like they took our jobs, right? I wonder what happens when it's not a society or not a race of people or not a social group or whatever, but when it's robots, right? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's so interesting. How do you overcome, I guess, that gap that people have, I think, instinctively, that if you're replacing humans, not replacing humans, but if you are putting machines into roles, even if there's no people there now, I think people's knee-jerk reaction would be, well, like you said, why aren't there people there now? Shouldn't there be? If there's unemployment, why don't we just put the unemployed there?
I mean, there's a couple things I want to say to that. One is, why aren't there people there now? Like, well, it's expensive sometimes to train people up for whatever jobs they're lacking. But where we've been going with our research has been in the direction of, well, the robots are adding something of value that we aren't getting otherwise, or that you can get. So here's an example. So like, parents often read books with their kids. Sometimes they read them on a tablet, like digital books. And one beneficial behavior when you're reading books with a kid to help them learn vocabulary and understand language and like promote language development is to ask questions about what you're reading. But a lot of parents don't do that for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's their second language. Maybe they just don't know that they should be doing that. They're like, okay, we're getting through the book. That's great. So when a virtual character was added to a digital storybook that modeled beneficial reading and question asking behaviors, like asked questions, parents started doing that more themselves. And then you could, probably take the character out later and the parents will keep remembering, oh, yeah, I'm going to ask questions about this. This is fun. It's engaging with my kid. And the kid's learning more. So we can use technology to augment and support and facilitate in ways that we might not otherwise get. And that's one simple example. We've also seen with a robot, a small, cute, fluffy teddy bear robot that was designed to help kids when they are in hospitals for a long time. The robot's participation in a conversation between a child and their caregiver and their parent, having a robot in there too, led to more socially energetic conversations. It increased the positivity of the conversation. It increased the interaction among everyone else there.
Huh.
So there's things that the robot can provide, or it can facilitate human-human connection too. So it's not necessarily the robot's taking a job that a human could otherwise do. So that's one direction that we can go, thinking about technology coming in. I have one other direction, but you can comment on that first.
Well, so that's really interesting. I mean, so let me just, I am active reading now myself. Let me make sure I understood the vocabulary that was just said. What you're saying is that when a robot is present, it makes the human interaction more positive? It
can, depending on how you design it.
Okay. Got it. Okay. That's really interesting. Part of me wonders almost if that is because the robot, I wonder what effect there is if the robot gets more and more human-like. Like as you start to add things like, because I'm just thinking personally about even talking to people online, right? It's really easy to miss social cues online because there is no, there's no sarcasm button. There's no rolling of the eyes. There's emojis now, right? Which I guess kind of help, but you miss a lot of those social cues that you have.
Yeah.
I wonder if not having those social cues there lets people just express themselves better. I don't know. That's weird.
With these robots, though, we are designing them to have a lot of social cues. Maybe not as many as a human, but probably more than just text on a screen.
Sure, but you know what I'm saying, though, right? Like, I wonder
there's something different about the interaction.
Yeah, I wonder if you kind of had a way to like scale up, let's say, like, I don't know, a teddy bear with or without eyebrows or something. You know what I mean? Like, I wonder what effect that would have on the output. But that's super interesting. Okay, so that's angle one, I guess. Give me angle two.
Another reason I think people are really concerned when it comes to like robots taking their jobs, people taking their jobs, whatever. When robots, like, compared to other technology, I feel like robots kind of hit a sweet spot when it comes to like people's concern about technology. Because like other things, like we're not thinking computers are going to come take our jobs. It's robots. It's not like computers. It's not tablets. It's not other stuff. It's robots because of something about how I think it's about our fears about robots are kind of more existential.
Sure.
Like, we don't want to be replaced by something. Like robots kind of encroach on our uniqueness in that, we're human, we can use language, we have like sophisticated social cues, like social intelligence is above that of other animals, and all this great stuff that makes humans special. And robots, unlike other technology, can kind of come closer to human-like than any other kind of technology or art or representation of humans that is out there.
Well, it's sort of, I agree with you, actually. I think that it, and I think you made a really good point with that. I think the kind of quintessential image a lot of people have in their minds about this stuff, and I think you've made a really good point about the kind of existential dread. And I kind of want to get into that a little bit more here, because this is a podcast and we hope you get existential dread on your drive to work, I guess. We're just really hoping for ennui, right? That's really the feeling we're always going for. I'm thinking about in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, when his dad's job is taken over, the new one, he was the guy that put the little screws onto the caps onto the toothpaste things.
Right.
And then a robot comes and takes the job and does it better and replaces him and everyone else in the factory. And then he goes off and doesn't have a job anymore. I I actually wonder if it's not like kind of a still holdover response to industrialization, where like what must it feel like? What must it be like personally? And I don't think I would take this very well personally, to find out that the job you've done, a thing that you've built some identity around and
Mm-hmm.
provided for your family. I mean, you're essentially like a wrench, right? You're essentially a little a robot. Makes it seem like what you were doing was only valuable in as much as the company could use you as a tool,
Yep.
you know? And that I think is very uncomfortable for people. And so
Mm-hmm.
people realizing, or I think people finding out or thinking that, oh my God, um, the skills I had weren't really valuable. It was just the brute force that I could bring to this, or whatever you want to say about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's very uncomfortable. I can definitely see how that would not be a positive thing to have happen to somebody, just kind of like you said, existentially, you
Yeah,
know?
for sure. I mean, like, you find out that this machine can do your job just as well as you can, or better.
Right,
Like,
right.
that's not comfortable. Yeah.
No, but I mean, and it also seems to kind of take over. I think the thing that's funny though. So one of the machines that I always kind of harken back to whenever I think about these applications is I'm going to leave it as a nameless pharmaceutical company in a New England state, um, where so the joke in like biomedical research or biotechnological research is that you better be really excited about and really like pipetting things into little jars, right? Because that's what you do a lot of the
Uh-huh.
time. It's like, in my lab when we had undergrads come in, the first thing that we had them do was like, um, they would make solutions, or they would, do dishes or whatever. It's kind of like rote stuff. In a bio lab, it's like, well, they're going to be pipetting all of our stuff out. Um, I'll never forget. I went on a tour of a facility, and their like piece de la resistance, the thing that they were so excited about, was this giant robotic arm that could do like 100 pipettes, 100 pipetting tests or samples in like a second, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's just this big yellow arm that went around the room. It was just like sucking up chemical, then depositing it into little jars. And, they were like, look at this. No one in our company needs to pipette anything. It was like, that's so
Yeah.
cool. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth
Um,
pointing out that sometimes when you get technology to do some of these jobs, you realize that the job was actually kind of boring and mundane, and you're like,
well,
maybe it's freeing you up to do something more interesting.
that's what I think the ultimate promise has always been, right?
Yeah,
That
it has. Yeah.
you train for, 25 years to get a PhD in biomechanical engineering or biotechnology or pharmaceuticals or whatever. You don't want to be spending 80% of your time pipetting things.
Mm-hmm.
You'd
Mm-hmm.
rather be using that to think and everything else. And I think that for people, for people who um are kind of, let's say, educated or more trained. Maybe not educated is the wrong kind of word, because honestly, like, education suggests something else, but um people that have been in jobs for a long time and have risen up, I think that robotics has helped them,
Mm-hmm.
but it's more for sort of the jobs that are you don't need a lot of training for necessarily, or you do need a lot of training for and a lot of expertise at doing something, but the product itself doesn't seem to be as um maybe I don't know, not really worth automating, because that's not necessarily the case, but that the automation isn't almost what you're paying for is the personal touch. I'm thinking of things like, leather shoes that are
Okay.
handmade, or guitars,
Hmm.
or even yesterday was funny. I was watching how it's made, and I had no idea, but they make basketballs by hand still.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I was like, what the heck?
Did
Well,
not
not
know
like
that.
not completely by hand, but like, it's one person using a press that like they
Hmm.
cut the leather and then they cut the rubber and then
Hmm.
they put it on a machine to like wind the nylon around it and everything else. But yeah, I was sitting there like, I cannot believe there's not a robot to like move the rubber from the one machine to the other,
Mm-hmm.
Um it's those weird kind of niche places. And so that is a case where you think, well, a robot could do that. But again, making something like an artisan, you don't consider that to be robotable, or
Right.
I don't know. That's just it's so interesting. Speaking of robots taking over jobs, here's a word from our sponsors. And we're back. So earlier we talked about a little bit about the social aspects of robotics and where you see that field going and sort of what the hope was, I guess, and some of the effects on populations. But one thing I've always been interested in personally is sort of the history of this field and I guess kind of where it sits or where some of the biggest challenges are. Because, again, from the things that are hard to kind of scale up or the things that are hard to the challenges that are hard to tackle are always really interesting, I think, in these fields. But so the first thing I wanted to ask you, though, really is, I guess, sort of from your own perspective, what would you consider to be the first robot, or how would you consider, I guess, that to be that term or that idea to have developed over time?
I mean, as we said, it kind of depends on how you're defining a robot. But the word robot was coined in 1920 by he was a Czech playwright named Karl Čapek. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. His play was 1920, Rossum Universal Robots, RUR. Came from a word, an old Slavonic word, perhaps. I don't really know. That implied something about servitude and forced labor and something like that. So anyway. So the word's been around for 100 years, robot. But there have been automatons and machines that might be considered robot-like, going back to probably Aristotle.
That's really interesting. So it's mostly so the word too is robota, which means drudgery or hard work.
There we go. Drudgery.
Yeah, and it's the word for work in Russian as robota.
Okay. Yeah, that goes well with what we were talking about for robots taking over factory jobs and.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's an interesting thing. And now we think about robots as factory things and whatever. We also, I don't know. When I think of robots, I think about like Iron Man and
C-3PO.
Like AI being somehow part of it as well and everything else, which we talked about before, being kind of a misnomer almost. But I wonder, that's interesting that they kind of. So what? All right, so we're at this stage now where we're starting to see robots, I guess, in our homes a little bit, right? You said
robot vacuum cleaners,
vacuum cleaners, and everything else. But what are some of the biggest challenges, I guess, right now in robotics? What are the things that are keeping us from advancing that, if they're solved, the public should be excited about?
Some of the big challenges, I mean, until recently, and perhaps still now, at least with children, it's been understanding language, because people communicate with language more than anything else. I mean, there's all the nonverbal stuff that goes with it, but understanding what people say and the context in order to communicate something about whatever's going on in whatever context you're in, that's probably the hardest thing, because language is, and that's a couple parts. One is actually understanding what words mean, but the other is things like automatic voice recognition. I mean, you can dictate to your phone pretty well. Things like Alexa and Google Home, we're getting better at having voice assistants that will pick up what you're saying and give you a response that's probably reasonable most of the time. Fond memories of listening to some 3-year-olds try to tell Alexa to turn on the lights. And they're like, Alexa, turn on the lights. And like, oh, nothing's happening. Because it's not picking up their language.
Right, it's not understanding what they're saying. Right, of course, yeah.
Right. I mean, and that's not even getting to the problem of understanding what words mean, which is hard for humans sometimes.
Yeah, a whole other can of worms, right.
So a lot of the challenges are technical. I mean, because we can make, because you don't have to make a robot that's humanoid to be useful. So, like, I don't think the robotic mechanical problem, I don't think the mechanics of building a robot is the hard part right now. I think that's easily solvable. Like, people can make robots that move in interesting, useful ways. I mean, it depends on what you're building it for, I suppose. But I think it's all like the technical, like, how do you make a robot that can understand what people are saying in a useful way and respond in useful ways? But there's a lot of AI that goes into this. And that's a whole other bucket of worms there.
Right. So it's more that intersection area between, if we wanted to make a robot that could move like, say, C-3PO or whatever, we probably could.
I think you can do that, yeah.
Right. But the problem is getting it to do the things that we
Yeah.
would like
Do
it
the
to.
things you want it to do in a way that's like understandable and useful and interesting.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. It actually is one kind of funny thing. I'm always surprised. In my day job, we use a lot of kind of data, you know, data digging and computerized methodologies and all this other kind of stuff. And that seems really robust and everything else. And so I'm always surprised when, like, say with Google, my wife loves Google Home. And I'm always surprised when I tell Google Home like to play something on Spotify, it'll pick the it seems to be programmed to pick the worst possible version of the song I want. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I wanted to hear the other day, what did I want to hear? I've been driving my wife crazy with this. I wanted to hear 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton.
Okay.
It's just been stuck in my head like nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
And every time you ask Spotify to play 9 to 5 or you ask Google to play 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton on Spotify, it plays some live version that's like far inferior to the regular version. Terrible stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, that is really interesting. So, I agree with you, though. I mean, at least for my own personal life, I can see that being the challenge is getting it to do what you want. Do you think that there's kind of a minimum size? Do you think that there's a size limit, I guess, to what could be considered a robot? I'm thinking about things like, say, nanobots.
I mean, there's probably not. I don't know. I don't know much about nanobots.
Okay.
My experience is with robots that are about the size of a large teddy bear.
Okay. So we're talking like teddy bear sized.
Yeah, so teddy bears. Actually, and most of them are covered in fur as well, the ones that I've worked with.
Interesting.
To make them more friendly and accessible to children, and also, actually, this is an interesting thought about morphology of robots. None of the ones that I've worked with, and none of the ones designed by the Personal Robots Group at MIT, none of them are humanoid. They're all designed, the ones that we have for like preschool kids, 3 to 5-year-olds, they're designed to be cute, fluffy creatures that look more like a character that popped out of a Dr. Seuss book than something that looks like a robot. Like, it looks like a stuffed animal almost.
Okay.
Like stripes, bright colors, fur.
Interesting. So what do you purposefully stay away from humanoid features for some reason? Like, is it because of something like, say, the uncanny valley, or is it just because it's
actually,
more
I mean, that's part of it. Is because when you see something that looks, say, like a human, or if you see something that looks like a dog, there's like the Aibo robot dog that's popular. If you see something that looks like something you're familiar with, you expect it to act in certain ways, and your expectations about it will determine like how you interact with it, whether you're disappointed by it. So like if you get a robot dog and it doesn't really act like a dog, you're like, well, this is a pretty bad robot dog. But if you have a robot that looks like this fluffy, weird creature that acts like, I don't know, something, you're like, cool, it's a robot.
Okay, so it's more
so
about.
So a lot of it's about setting expectations.
That's really interesting. It's such a weird thing, actually. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the robot dogs and everything else. Those like videos that always come out.
Mm-hmm.
Because I actually hadn't even realized to myself that if you look at them as kind of like what they're designed to do, they're operating phenomenally well, right?
Yeah.
But in your head, though, you're like, this doesn't look like a dog. But that doesn't matter. It
doesn't really act like a dog.
It's not supposed to. Yeah,
it's not good at chasing that ball. It's like
right, but it's like it's not supposed to be a dog. It's supposed to be a robot. Man, that's interesting. So it's so weird. Like, I mean, what would you say? I guess what do you think are going to be the biggest developments if you had to? And I know being in the kind of being in sort of the scientific prediction game is always impossibly challenging because you never know when something happens or whatever. But if you had to guess what the biggest change we'll see to social robots in the next 10 years, is there a social robot you think that we'll start to see in our life, like in our daily lives in the next 10 years?
Based on what I know is being developed by people in research labs and startup companies, we're going to be seeing more in education and healthcare for sure.
Okay, so you think that those will be the biggest areas where we see those things?
I think those are some of the areas, like healthcare in particular, are some of the areas where we have the largest need for intervention of some kind, and technology like social robots is one of the ways that we're going to try to fill that need.
Interesting. So what are some of those needs?
So like in nursing, we have huge aging populations. I know in Japan there's a lot of research groups working on robots that can help in all sorts of different ways with their aging populations.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's like nursing assistants. Like I mentioned the teddy bear robot that's like interacting with kids, like facilitating their interactions with like their time in the hospital. There's So Corey Kidd, who was a graduate of the Personal Robots group at MIT, like he has a startup, Catalia Health, where they've got this robot Mabu that's designed to like support people for like long periods of time with a variety of different health conditions. It looks like they're working on a project now around, like there's some like heart disease related projects. There were some around, goodness, I don't know where on the website.
Well, I'm even thinking,
but anyway.
but that's really interesting. I'm even thinking, say things like, I mean, just after I asked that question, I was like, well, duh, there's all kinds of things. I mean, I'm thinking for my own personal life, hey, remember to check your blood pressure today, or remember
there's a lot of different ways that you could use a robot to support people in remembering to do different activities, or like there's work from like 10 years ago that came out of our group, research group, looking at how like the robot versus like a paper log or versus like a computer program could support people like with their long-term weight maintenance goals. Just like having a little social interaction helps help people stay motivated, help them stay on top of their goals. So there's a lot of different ways that you could incorporate a social robot into different parts of a healthcare process.
Cool. Okay. And so if you had to pick, so this is another thing we always like to ask kind of scientists that come on the show and talk to us about their work. If there is one myth or one, I guess, kind of frequent, frustrating thing in the media or out there in the science fiction world or whatever that you see about your field, what would you want people to know about it? What myth would you like to see busted?
And we've already talked about it. It's the robots are taking my job.
Okay.
Also, they're taking over the world.
Right. Sure. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, for the taking over the world part, I mean, if you have a Roomba, you've probably seen it get stuck on the carpet or like on the little lip between like the carpet and the wood floor.
Yes.
Yeah,
every day.
Like
every day of my life.
The robots go up the stairs, the robots can't get you.
Well, I mean, did you ever see that thing? There's like a really funny, I think it's just a photo or whatever, but it's a Roomba with like a knife duct tape to it.
Yeah, right?
It's like the death Roomba. I mean, but at the same time though, I think there is something to be said about, or there is something, but this is again, more of a human problem, not the robot themselves necessarily, but like, let's say like Google Home, right? I mean, that thing is listening all the time.
Yeah.
But that is something that we accepted when we brought it into our home.
Right. Like my life insurance company or home insurance company gave us an Amazon Echo because they made an app for it about like home safety or something. Mm-hmm. We don't plug it in. Like we don't have like an Echo sitting there listening to us all the time.
Interesting. Okay.
Part of that is because of concerns about data and privacy and security, because I think that's kind of more of a bigger problem. And it's people that are the problem more so than like the robot. Because like we're the ones building and designing and programming these things.
Right. It's not like they can. I mean, but that's ultimately the fear, I guess. Right. It's more of a fear of almost artificial intelligence than it is a fear of the robots themselves.
Yeah.
Although, if I don't know. I mean, it is really, really interesting. There's one other thing too that I always wondered with one thing that's really interesting with robots, I guess, or kind of with the social effect of robots and things like that, that's always been really interesting to me. How much of that knowledge do you think is sort of, baked in now to the human population? So I'm thinking like, for instance, if the kind of example I always think about is, my cousins, my little cousins and stuff, they all grew up with iPads. You know what I mean? They grew up with phones. They grew up with all these things. And so now they're just so comfortable having them everywhere that when they tell me, we use this for school, in my head, I'm always like, that would be so weird to me because I'm used to a pen and paper. Mm-hmm. I guess I wonder, though, how much of that initial knowledge, that fundamental knowledge, like I'm thinking shows like, let's say, like The Walking Dead or any of these apocalypse shows where the world's, something crazy happens to the world or whatever, and then all that technology gets lost. Mm-hmm. How much, I guess, of like, do you feel like people are adequately knowledgeable about robotics, just in their daily lives, I guess? Do you think it's something that we should be teaching kids?
Yeah. So I think that while kids interact with technology in very different ways than we did when we were kids, because they have a very different kind of technology, very different relationships with technology, very different understanding of what it can do, I don't think most kids have any idea of what it can do. The capabilities of like how AI works, or like why is it giving them the answers it's giving them? How does it work that way? How can they influence it? Like, there are multiple people in the Personal Robots group at MIT right now working on AI ethics and AI education to teach kids how this stuff works, who programmed it, because like you've probably seen some stuff in the news about like a bias in AI, you know, like what your training set is, what your data set is that you train algorithms on really matters. And like this kind of stuff, like the facial recognition is huge right now. It's like a big controversial area because a lot of the facial recognition stuff works really well on white men because that's what's predominantly in the data set, but like works terribly on, like you might have seen like the like when Google, I think it was Google, was training algorithms to automatically like label pictures. It was labeling like gorillas as black men. That is because of their data set and their training set. But that's the kind of thing that's like invisible to most users. Like they don't have any idea how that sort of stuff gets trained or developed. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need more education around.
Okay, so how? Yeah. So actually, like
how does it actually work? Why is it doing this? Like, yeah,
because you know what I'm thinking is, and I saw this a lot in a previous job, and we hear about it a lot. Is things like, you know, you got a plant that's running, like a chemical plant that's running, humming along fine for 20 years. The guys that initially helped kind of run it and, you know, whatever, decide to retire, and then the new batch of people who come in, you know, whoever the new floor manager is or whoever's running the machines or whatever, like he or she is like, well, it works this way, but I don't know, you know, I don't know why we picked this initial pump, right? Or I don't know why we did this other thing. That kind of institutional knowledge gets lost, and over time it just kind of gets baked in. I think that's, I don't know. It just seems like such an interesting thing. I wonder, just like with, let's say, chemistry, where the stuff that we feel is appropriate to teach high schoolers gets more and more advanced as the years go on, because our, you know, kind of what they need to know to understand the world gets more and more advanced. I wonder if I've always been surprised that I went to a very kind of technically focused high school, and the amount of knowledge on robotics that I got was from like being in the Lego Robotics Club.
Oh, okay.
You know, but that was it. You know, and then I got all the way through a PhD, and I feel like I know nothing about robots or how they work. Yeah,
I mean, I didn't learn any computer science until I got to college. I had no idea what it was.
Yeah, see, I mean, that's it's just so interesting the way that
I was homeschooled and didn't realize that there was something interesting. At some point, I was just like, hey, you know, I'd like to know how computers work. Well, I'm going to sign up for a class on that.
Right. Oh, it's so interesting. I don't know. It's going to be crazy. I'm just hoping. So so I always make this joke on the show, and I was about to make it to you, and then I was like, wait a second. She knows enough to know that this is a stupid joke. How close are we to robot bodies? And I know we're not close at all.
Like people?
Yeah, like if, like, let's say, like, I decided, you know, if I started right now just eating cheeseburgers for the rest of my life, am I gonna make it to like being able to be put into a robot body?
No.
Yeah, I know I won't, but it's so depressing.
There's some really cool stuff around like robotic prosthetics that's going on in like Hugh Hare's group at the Media Lab. There's some really cool stuff with like the kind of things they can do now. Which is different than getting a robot body. It's a little bit more like being a cyborg.
Right. Which, I mean, it would be fine too, I guess. I just, you know, just can't wait. I can't wait. Anyways, no, really interesting. It was great having you on. Seriously, thank you for taking the time to talk to us and share your story with our listeners and things.
Yeah, fun chatting about this stuff.
Yeah, I had a super good time. Anything else you'd want people to know? Where can they find you? Where can they find kind of your research work? Anything else?
You can find links to pretty much everything on my personal website, jakory.com.
Cool. Okay, we'll put a link to that in the show notes, of course, as always.
You can find me on Twitter, all that stuff.
Perfect. Great stuff. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on, and thank you, dear listeners, for spending another hour with the Mad Scientist podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at madscientistpod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Because we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal.